Melissa, thank you so much for joining us here today. Can you share with us your story? You know, you're the survivor of a failed saline infusion abortion, right? How did that come about?
Yeah, I think it's important that we share stories of babies who survive abortions. We're real people with real experiences. And, there have been times where even in DC, members of Congress have said, you're not relevant to this conversation. And we have to acknowledge that this happened before Roe, it happened during Roe, and it's still happening after Roe. And so that's where I fit into that historical context of it is, I survived a saline infusion abortion about 4 years after Roe versus Wade.
Wow.
So it was 1977. And, it's taken me a lot of my life to piece together my experience. And that started with my birth mom's experience. And so that's what I now know. She was 19. My birth mother wasn't married at the time to my birth father. They were actually engaged. Unfortunately, they weren't given the opportunity to carry me to term and parent me. And we have to acknowledge that that happens in too many women's lives as well. And now I know that abortion was forced upon my birth mom. It was the most common procedure back in the 70s, and lots of people still remember it. But it involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. And the intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald me to death. So typically lasted about 72 hours. If the child was fortunate enough, their life was ended within about the first 24. And then the rest of that time was spent inducing labor with the intent of a deceased child being expelled from the womb.
And how old were you when this happened?
It's interesting. My medical records reflect that my abortionist thought my birth mother was about 18 to 20 weeks pregnant.
Okay.
But the reality is he didn't provide an adequate exam. He didn't know how far along she was. And I hear this time and time again from women who have similar experiences to my birth mother. So my medical records stated 18 to 20. But through those medical records, we also know I soaked in that toxic salt solution for not 24 hours or 72. I actually soaked in it for 5.
Oh my gosh.
So they just kept trying to induce my birth mother's labor, and they weren't successful until that 5th day. And I now know that during those 5 days, they started to think my birth mom might lose her life because the abortion was taking too long. And again, this is one of those stubborn facts that the abortion industry doesn't like to talk about, that obviously an abortion is intending to take a child's life.
Right.
And it puts the woman's life at risk as well. And on the 5th day of that abortion procedure, they induced her labor, and that's when I was accidentally born alive in the final step. So I'm sort of the poster child of what most people think an abortion survivor is.
Wow, that's incredible. So you soaked in this poisonous saline solution for 5 days, and yet you were still born alive. I'm sure what the obvious question people are going to wonder is, did it impact you at all? How is it affecting your quality of life?
I am not who people think I am, right? And that's okay. I think people are very surprised anytime they meet a survivor. Most of us, if you passed us on the street, you wouldn't know that we survive the types of things that we have. When I was first rushed off to the NICU, that's when they started to get that greater picture, that my birth mom was probably more like 31 weeks pregnant. That's what a neonatologist remarked in my medical records.
Wow.
And so I weighed a little less than 3 pounds. I was 2 pounds, 14 ounces. That's how they started to kind of piece together what was really happening. I presented with extreme distress. They actually thought I had a fatal heart defect because of the amount of distress I was under. Obviously, soaking in a toxic salt solution for 5 days, I was under a lot of distress.
Oh my gosh.
I suffered from seizures, severe respiratory, liver problems, and, they were very guarded about what my future might look like. I was adopted not long after I survived that abortion attempt. And, by the time I was, a year old, my parents started to get good prognosis from the doctor saying, she's meeting all of her milestones. She's probably going to go on to live a quote unquote healthy, normal life.
Right.
Most of us carry very internal scars, right? The emotional, the mental, the spiritual. And I often like to remind people we live in this culture that talks about abortion as a choice and a right. And so for people like me, we can't even be on social media. You can't be watching the news without getting this feedback about abortion, which ultimately is our identity.
Right. Wow. So as an abortion survivor, how do you feel when you see this kind of rhetoric saying, "Oh, this choice matters above all else," or women's reproductive health decisions, it's up to the woman. We hear about this so much nowadays, especially heading into this next season where we're going to be talking about abortion so much. How does that make you feel?
It's different for me now, obviously, than it was when I first found out my
Yeah.
story when I was 14. So I found out my parents, like many, had kept it a secret. And so it was absolutely devastating to learn that news because it made me, of course, question everything about being placed for adoption and, why couldn't I have been placed for adoption instead of this abortion attempt? But my greatest pain really came from knowing what our culture said about abortion. And so I see that even in our young survivors today. So our youngest survivors are babies in the womb right now who have survived an attempt to abort them. And they're not safe from a follow-up attempt. This is also part of the conversation we need to have. But we also have, childhood age survivors. We have teenagers. And the feedback I always get from them is, right, I'm watching people. When Roe fell, I saw people and they were angry. Why are they angry? This is a good thing.
Right.
So it is this process that survivors are continuously having to get healing and support from one another. That is one of the most, I think, redemptive things I get to do with my experiences. Make things differently, not just in educating and advocating in the public square, but making things different for survivors.
Tell us about Abortion Survivors Network and the people that you encounter through it.
We've been a nonprofit now for about 5 years and really woulda, coulda, shoulda been before that, but I had prayed for a long time looking around the pro-life movement, knowing that there had never been an organization who served
Right.
the babies who survived abortions or their moms who needed support or families who were impacted by it. And so became a nonprofit in 2019 really because the influx of people I had been personally helping over the years became so great that I couldn't do it alone.
Right.
And, for context, I want people to understand that's when New York was lighting up pink, right? We saw Governor Northam talking about laying babies aside like me after they survived abortions. And so those very events, people were watching, right? The people with these hidden stories were being impacted by it. So, since that time, we have strategically looked at what's happening even post-Roe, and our mission really has landed on the reality that we're called to intervene in the life of an abortion survivor from the first chance that we're given, right? To save them however that looks like. Maybe that means reaching that woman who attempted to abort that baby and she's being coerced by her OB to do it again or being told, right, the treatment course you should take is another abortion, another abortion, another abortion. Wow. So that might be the first point that we intervene in a survivor's life. It might be when that kiddo is 10 and their adoptive parents know that they need to share the story. So that's when our social workers will come in, help the family have conversations about abortion, about babies surviving abortions, right? And then we can get to the point where that child learns their story. Because so many survivors give us the feedback to say, I could have had a different life if my family would have been helped.
Yeah.
There wouldn't have been so much underlying trauma, all of those things. So we might intervene there, or we might intervene with an abortion survivor when they're 60, 70 years old and their parent is on their deathbed and says, by the way, I need to tell you what I did.
Wow. What a revelation to find out at the end of your parents' life. Wow. So how many abortion survivors do you think you've come in contact with?
We've been connected with well over 700, but what I want people to understand is really that's the tip of the iceberg. We know statistically that the data is very hard to come by, but when you look at Canadian rates on failure rates of abortion, that looks like about 0.21%, which correlated to the United States looks like 1,734 surgical abortion survivors only.
Wow.
That doesn't include successful abortion pill reversal babies, doesn't include at-home attempts to abort, all of those things. So if I was not in these shoes as a survivor and I was a person in the general public, I would want an answer to this. Instead of being continuously told, this doesn't happen, right? Born alive legislation isn't needed. These abortion survivors are, Republican-made attempts to restrict women's reproductive rights.
Right.
Can't we critically think through this and say, shouldn't we know this?
Right. That seems so important. It seems like such a no-brainer that we should be able to have that information. So, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but we do have media activists and lawmakers who will look us in the eye and say, late-term abortions aren't happening.
Mm-hmm.
They're very, very rare. Babies are never born alive in botched abortions. No one wants abortion up until birth. What do you, as an abortion survivor, say to them?
There's a lot. There's a lot I have to say. I mean, my first one is, that argument that late-term abortions don't happen. Read the statistics. Look through the state and national reports that tell us that it does. And for me, in the work that I do, I can tell you that when I look at the lives of survivors, we get that feedback time and time again that, right, my birth mom, my mom thought she was less than 20 weeks. By the time she went in for that abortion, she was much further along. And so they couldn't complete the abortion successfully, or they were told it was going to have to be a different procedure. Again, when they negate a survivor's life, they are also preventing that information from being heard and understood.
Wow.
So stop, painting us as these villains and acknowledge that we are who we are, that this happens, and then look through that information, right? Because this is how we get the answers.
And I would just love to touch on, lastly, the mothers who are going through with these abortions. Did you ever reconnect with your birth mother who ultimately gave you up for adoption?
Yeah, every survivor's experience is different. And, we are very diverse, from the type of procedure we survive to our outcomes to even if we're raised by biological families. So we've actually found that more survivors are raised in their biological family than placed for adoption, which is surprising until we think about the fact that the baby was never really the problem, right? It was the life circumstances, coercion, force, whatever it was. Now, granted, when we're not serving those families, because our culture doesn't allow us to reach them, to have these honest conversations, then there can be difficult outcomes in families. But for me personally, so I was placed for adoption. I found out my story when I was 14, ultimately connected with my birth family.
Wow.
So my birth mother's a huge part of my life. Her name is Ruth. We live in the same city. We all live in the Kansas City metro area. I didn't know that when I moved there.
Wow.
So my kids are raised alongside their cousins, because one of my half-sisters is there too. And for me, that is just the greatest blessing, that she knows her baby survived, because that was this really deep secret I didn't know and my adoptive parents didn't know, is that she was told the abortion was successful.
Wow. Wow.
She didn't know if I was a boy or a girl.
Wow.
And so that was a 30-year journey of pain.
Oh my gosh. So 30 years later, she found out that no, it wasn't successful. Do you mind sharing with us her reaction or how you reunited?
Part of the dynamic that makes my experience unique is that it was her family who forced the abortion. Now, again, right, we hear these stories a lot, but in her circumstances, my grandmother was a prominent nurse, worked at that hospital, worked with the OB who also performed the abortions.
Right.
So that's how they forced the abortion on her. Okay. They knew that I had survived, and it was kept a secret.
Oh my gosh.
I now know that actually nurses in the NICU were told not to tell my birth mom that I had survived. I know that because they've approached me with that information.
Oh my gosh.
So when she finally found out, it was this great family secret that was finally, coming to light. And she was obviously shocked and grateful at the same time. We hear from women routinely at the Abortion Survivors Network who say, could you help me find out if my baby survived my abortion too?
Wow.
And again, that's what I want people to have to face every single day as they talk about abortion, or they want to deny that this happens. Put yourself in my shoes and respond to these women in their hurt.
Yeah.
Because they're hurting women by denying that that hurts them. But my birth mom knows that she's so blessed to have her child survive her abortion. We spent a few years getting to know each other by email and phone and exchanging photos before we finally met face to face for the first time, really because I wanted her to know that I do love her the way that I say that I do, and for her to trust me. I mean, she had so many experiences in her life that told her not to trust people.
Wow.
So for me, setting that secret free in our family and loving her unconditionally, really, that's the most important thing I ever could have done with my life.
That's beautiful. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. We're so grateful, and it's very inspiring to hear.
Thank you.